Good evening, everybody. Welcome to licensing on the 10th of February. There are no fire alarms scheduled for this evening's. Therefore, if the fire alarm goes off, please evacuate the building immediately. The fire exits are located at the rear of the room. Go down the stairs and meet in the War Memorial Park. Please note that this meeting is being webcast live on the internet. The webcast will also be published on YouTube after the meeting. Check with officers for connection. Yes? Right. I thought I'd draw it out a bit. Apologies for absence and substitutions? No, nobody. Declarations of interest?
Story of my life.
Urgent matters? There are none. Minutes of the meeting held on the 4th of November. Do you agree? Thank you. Licensing fees and charges. Over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, councillors. Hopefully you've all had a chance to read through the fees and charges report for 2020. The request for most fees from the council has been that fees are increased by, on average, 3% across the board. That is what's been done for the majority of these. Some of them hover around the 3% to try and give a round figure rather than too many decimals. So I don't think there's too much there. The other two areas where there is either zero increase or a substantial increase are that of taxi licensing and animal welfare fees. I'll deal with the taxi licensing first. The proposal is that there is no increase in taxi fees this year. Now, obviously, that's against the council recommendation at this point in time. The reason being is that we've had two contradictory pressures within the licensing fees and charges. The legislation is extremely clear on setting of fees for taxi purposes, which is that it is strictly cost recovery. There's no area for income generation there. As part of that process, my team leader, Sophie Bruff here, has been working hard to bring both Hart and Basingstoke teams together, which we've successfully done, into one properly shared service, to harmonise and standardise the processes of those two teams, which obviously gives us efficiency benefits. And lastly, to bring in electronic applications for all licence types. Now, that latter one has the potential for making the most savings. However, it has also been somewhat fraught in that it's a new product from our suppliers, and we're fair to say that we've had some technical issues getting that up and running. We focused on the Licensing Act 2003 documents, as they are the most straightforward and least controversial, before we move on to the taxi ones. So we're making some progress in that area, but it would be fair to say that we have not achieved the cost savings that we would wish to at this point in time. And since we haven't achieved them, we've been unable to pass them on to the drivers. Against that is a recent ruling following a taxi fees and charges case, which has brought a rather unexpected redefinition of the word administrative charges from the 1976 Local Government Miscellaneous Provisions Act. We've been using that act, strangely, since 1976, and we were all pretty clear in the licensing trade that the words administration was very much about the processing and production of licenses for taxi drivers. However, the court ruling at the end of last year indicated that the term administration also covers the enforcement of said fees and charges. Taxi driver licenses, and that's a considerable change for us, because previously we have, like every other licensing authority in the country, absorbed that cost. Because we felt the legislation didn't support us passing that cost on to the drivers. This legal ruling, however, would seem to indicate that we should be passing that cost back to the drivers by way of the taxi licensing fee for driver badges. That is likely to see a considerable increase in the cost of driver licenses. Now, that's a big change which would have a significant impact upon our drivers, and not one that we would wish to rush into without some further guidance and clarification. So, like all other authorities around the country, we are in the process of seeking some advice and guidance on how this change, if it should be brought in, how it should be brought in, the extent to which it was brought in, without having an adverse impact upon the trade, which it is likely to do. So, bearing in mind those two conflicting elements, one where we're looking to bring the cost of licenses down, and one potential legal change which could see the cost of licenses being increased, we felt that for this time we would rather put it on freeze, except that there may be some loss of income, which I think is identified in the report of 4,100 this year. But that would protect us from any potential legal challenge and ensure that we would go forward next year with a much clearer and more balanced idea of the fees that we should be charging our drivers. I'll stop there and see if there's any questions that anybody wants to ask on that particular points.
Councillor Putty.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Draper, you said something about the word administration. Is there any other word that we can use that would be much more like everybody can understand what it is about than using the word administration?
We use that because that's the word that's in the Act. So no, there is no choice about that. And up until, say, very recently, the meaning was taken to be the one that you and I would generally understand, which is the back office task of receiving, processing and issuing of the licence. It is only this recent court ruling that has indicated that we should encompass the enforcement within that definition.
Yes, Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Draper, so could I just understand there's a potential £4,100 shortfall. Are we breaking rules by not covering that with the licence fee? Thank you.
We don't recover anywhere near our costs for driver enforcement as it is, and haven't done since 1976. So we could issue the licences free of charge. It is entirely up to us how much we charge the licences. What we cannot do is charge more than it costs us to produce the licence.
Councillor Jones.
Thank you, Chair. The same issue. My concern is that, not this year, but next year, how much are we talking of possibly going out? Have we worked on a figure? Because it doesn't just affect the drivers, it affects the customers, and that's the concern. I know you're coming from the same hymn sheet there, but it does concern me that these things change like this, because it's one of the things since I've been on this committee. I've always been saying we've been charging too much for this, too much for that. We shouldn't be making profits. We should be breaking even. And as a council on licensing, we seem to be going in that direction, which is great news. But I do have concerns that next year, when we look at fees and charges, you may be still in post, hopefully. You may have a different chair, but people are looking at it different, and we'll end up with a huge rise. And I don't want that to happen. You know, we need to, what we really need is a paper to come back at some stage when you know more about what's going on, to explain it to us, and as a council we can actually change it if, you know, we make the rules once it's gone through full council. So we may not get to that point where we're putting huge sums on taxi drivers and that, because at the moment, you don't have to answer, but I do know a lot of them are struggling now out there. Some aren't, but a lot of them are.
Thank you, Councillor. Yes, I mean, and the licensing team are very sensitive to the economics of the taxi trade. We live and breathe taxi licensing day in, day out, so we're under no delusions about the potential impact of this. Firstly, on driver incomes, and obviously that for the private hire trade, they can pass any additional costs straight onto their customer very quickly and easily. But for our Hackney carriage trade, where we as an authority set the tariff, were we to sharply increase the fees for driver badges, then we would almost certainly come under pressure to see an increase in the tariff that could be charged. So again, all these fees ultimately find their way back to the travelling public. As I replied to Councillor Vaux, the issue here is that we may decide that we wish to recover more of our costs, but we don't have to do that all in one hit. We could look for a staged approach. We could, as an authority, decide that we will absorb the cost, as we have done since 1976. There is no pressure upon us to do anything about this as a knee-jerk reaction, and the purpose of freezing the fees this year is to give us precisely what you've requested, some time and space to think about this, to get some expert and legal opinion, and then to look at how we can move forward. And there may yet be some further legal challenge to this ruling.
Any other questions? Otherwise,
On taxis or everything?
the whole paper.
I'll do the animal welfare one now, because I suspect that's the thing. I assume we're all happy on taxis.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Thanks, Chair. Just on the Appendix 1, just to understand, there's a whole list of things like rear plate mounting kit, front plate mounting kit, new replacement front plate, whatever. How do we cost those? Thank you.
We cost them a lot more realistically than we did a couple of years ago. So basically, it is the cost of the item from our supplier, which is what we used to charge, and we used to charge flat rate. Now we've increased that to put some additional costs on that looks at our collection, our storage, our VAT, our handling of those items. So they're now much more realistically priced than they were. The only fee that you'll probably notice that has had a marked change for taxis is the DBS cost, which is dropped by 9.1%. And that's the fee that's set externally to us. It's set by the DBS. It was 44 and is now 40. And again, so we've passed that saving straight on to the drivers.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. I'm not sure, Rob, whether or not probably not the right place to discuss it, but I wonder when it comes down to that additional money you may need to charge or pass on to drivers, is that a council could use some form of incentive scheme in relation to, say, push into maybe towards electric vehicles as a balancing out. So, if you understand what I'm saying, so it's an incentive. So rather than having to, if you're going to start looking towards having an electric vehicle for your business, in local areas in particular, that you would end up, being able to sort of get a cheaper option or a discount via that, or whether that's something we could do. I don't know whether it's feasible.
In the short answer, no. The reason being is that the individual elements of taxi licensing are costed according to their delivery cost. So the cost of licensing a vehicle is separately developed and cannot be wrapped up in driver enforcement, and it cannot be wrapped up in private hire operator enforcement. So those different types of licenses, the reason we have this new bit of ruling was because that was exactly what the local authority concerned was attempting to do. Okay. They were attempting to combine the costs effectively of vehicle enforcement and driver enforcement. However, in a rough answer to your question, if you look at the top of page 13 in your document there, you can see that the fee for Hackney carriages emitting less than 50 grams of CO2 per kilometre is 0. So anybody who operates either a fully electric or one of the new London-style taxis effectively has no licensing fee to pay. So there is an incentive already within the policy.
Thank you. Cheers.
Right, moving on to animals.
Thank you, Councillor Leake. Right, so the legislation concerning animal welfare changed substantively in 2018, and 2019-2020 saw our first year of implementing the new legislation. That has seen a very different style of licensing going forward to a risk-based approach. Those of you who do food and health and safety will be familiar with that type of approach, but that hasn't traditionally been done in animal welfare, but it is now. So last year we, and I say we, or rather I, set a set of fees through yourselves with the aim of looking at a revised style fee structure to reflect the work that will be required to bring this legislation in and undertake those inspections. I think it would be fair to say that we underestimated the amount of time it would take to bring our businesses with us into the new risk-based system. And as a consequence of that, the time that officers are spending on site was considerably more than we had originally budgeted for. So I've now sat down with the Animal Welfare Licensing Officer, Karen Hill, and rejigged the time element. Time is the singularly most expensive element that we do, and that has seen a large percentage rise in some of those costs. That is in no way looking to recover the under-recovery of this year. That would not be fair on the businesses. It is simply a reflection of our costs moving forwards. It should also be noted within these costs that that we haven't got many new ones coming through now. We're now mainly on the interim and renewal type inspections because obviously they were all new last year and this year they're now renewals. So yes, the percentage increases there do look rather large, but unfortunately that reflects the time that we've put in. And as with taxi licensing, we are only allowed to recover the cost of the work that we do. And I'm afraid these costs do reflect that time that we've been spending. We have, for example, even a relatively routine inspection of a small premises, which we thought might take an hour and a half, we've discovered is taking us 3 or 4 hours. And on one of them, we actually had to spread it over 2 days of inspection because we ran out of time on the first day. So there has been a considerably larger amount of on-site time than we previously anticipated.
Councillor Jones.
I wonder if you can explain. I understand what you said, but originally you were going to, as I understand it, you were saying originally you thought the time to inspect these places would have been less, become more. why have they become more? If it's a straightforward inspection, and then if there's a problem after that, it becomes more, I would have said, but it doesn't to me, it doesn't make sense what you're telling me. I wonder if you can explain why it's taking more time. Is it because the individual who runs that place is not doing the job or not understanding where they should be? And therefore, if it is, surely that will, over a period of time, that cost will come down, not go up.
Thank you, Councillor. The new legislation that came in 2018 was substantially more complex than the legislation that's been in before. It involved hundreds of pages of guidance that were being issued to everybody who wanted an animal welfare licence. So that's everybody from catteries to dog boarders to breeders to pet shops and horse riding establishments. What the two officers that do the animal welfare licensing found that despite the guidance from DEFRA came out, I think, the day after the legislation came in. So unfortunately, there was very little opportunity for us to work with our licence holders and potential licence holders prior to the legislation coming in to make sure they were up to spec and had all the paperwork in place, all the cleaning routines, vaccination records that were now required under the new legislation, which meant all the work that needed to be done with our applicants and our customers had to be done when the legislation was in, and we were trying to get them licensed. So when we originally thought that an inspection may take an hour and a half, we were expecting to turn up to these inspections, the applicants to have all of their paperwork together, go through it, get it done, sign it off, and it be a relatively simple inspection. Unfortunately, that was not the case. Karen Hill in particular has spent a lot of time working with licence holders, going back, doing multiple inspections in some cases to make sure that they can meet the minimum standards that have now been set under this legislation. Also, the legislation gives the risk rating, which is a star-based rating. Depending on your star rating, depends how long you can get your licence for, which can either be 1 year or 3 years. So obviously anybody who ended up with a 1-year licence had a much quicker interim inspection and has got to have this renewal much quicker. So there was an awful lot of work that needed to go into getting our customers to the point where they could be licensed. And a lot of our customers have come in with low-rated licenses because they only met the minimum standards. There are higher standards. It's quite a complex bit of legislation. Basically, nobody had time, that's the customers and ourselves as the licensing authorities, to get the applicants up to where they needed to be licensed. So there was a lot of work that had to go in to get them there, which meant, as Rob said, some inspections went on to 6 hours because of the amount of detail that Karen had to go into to make sure they could be licensed. We are expecting for some of those renewals to be much quicker because hopefully all the paperwork is in place and they've been keeping up with their records and they've been doing everything they need to do under the new legislation. So it could be that when we come to review these fees again, some of it could go down, but this is very much based on, I believe Karen's longest inspection was nearly 7.5 hours of working with the customer. So it is based on that, as Rob has said. We're not looking to recoup what has already gone. We're just trying to make sure that it reflects the work that is going forward at the moment. And we are finding that new customers coming in now, even though the legislation has been out for over a year, are still not fully understanding the complexity of the legislation or the guidance that they have to deal with. On top of that, we understand that DEFRA are making further changes to the guidance that they have already issued, which could mean having to work with our customers again to make sure that they meet the new guidance coming out, which we haven't seen yet. We don't know when it's coming out, but we tend to get it at the same time that the customers get it. So we have to work through it all together with them. Bit of a complex answer, or a long-winded answer, I'm afraid, Councillor. Basically, it's very complex. We had to do a lot of work with our customers, which reflected in the amount of time that Karen had to spend working with them, and Andrew Wake, who does the horse establishment inspections. It wasn't easy or straightforward, I'm afraid.
Is it a shorter question?
It's not going to be a debate because that was a bit too much for me. No, to my mind, when you the way you're saying it, to me, I'm thinking, well, if you've got a minimum charge, any time, you call a plumber out, you pay a charge, don't you? Then the hour after that, you pay another charge. would we not be better to look at that? Because if, for instance, I had a cattery, which I haven't, and you was out for your standard hour and a half or whatever and you paid that fee, which was covered. But if I hadn't done the paperwork, I hadn't got anything in place, and you're out there for 6 hours, that charge should go up for those people, and therefore it makes people who own these places more diligent the way they look after their paperwork. It's just seems to me a ludicrous, well, not ludicrous, a bit strong, a bit. It seems a bit of a shame that other people are paying for some of the work that the individual should do because you're spending so much officer time on it. Sorry, really long-winded, but.
No, I totally take your point there, and some of the fees are set. For example, with the certainly with the riding establishments, there's a vet fee which is quite, if they've got more horses, then it takes longer, and the costs are more proportionate. The reason that we have a set fee is because we're obliged to legally to do so. Second, I think we have a moral obligation because these are effectively small businesses, and whilst they cost may be slightly higher, at least it's a fixed cost for the business and they can budget for that. And I think that does make it easier for these people to manage that because they know what it's going to cost them. The difficulty they've had and the difficulty we've had is, as Sophie's already alluded to, the lack of advanced guidance on the legislation and also the complexity of that in many regards. And they have really struggled, and we've really struggled, to be quite honest with you, and had to go back to DEFRA on multiple occasions for clarification and guidance on these issues so that we can issue some clear advice. So we're very keen not to penalise those businesses which may be perceived as being ill prepared just because they've been struggling with inconsistent advice. And it covers a huge range, this advice, as well. So we know that some of that has been relatively straightforward in some bits of the Act, and other bits of the Act, the advice has been fairly poor and difficult. So again, it's all about trying to provide a more level playing field for the businesses.
Any more questions? Yes, Councillor.
Not so much a question, Chair, as a comment, and nothing to do with Rob and Sophie, but there's an assumption here, and a budget's a budget, a budget's a forecast, that a strategy assumes a 3% increase in inflation. And we can argue this at other places, not at licensing. But when I looked yesterday, it was 1.8%.
I can't answer that. I don't know why I haven't looked. I don't know. Or to discuss it at council.
Just briefly, it could be, I'm not saying it is, but it could be that the particular inflationary prices involved here, which we understand are about staff, the increases for staff costs are actually a lot higher than the increase in other costs. And so the inflationary figure you've looked at is a bundle, whereas these are looking primarily at staff costs.
Any other questions to officers, apart from inflation? Right, do you want any debate? Councillor.
Actually, the paper is really good this year. We've always whinged over the years. People have been on this committee, we've whinged like hell about the way it's been presented to us. It's really good, you can actually understand it. Might not like all of it, but we understand it.
Thank you, Councillor.
Yes, thank you. Right, the recommendation is to... Sorry, yes, Councillor.
In the event that we've got things wrong here, and 6 months down the line or 3 months down the line, that can be seen clearly. Is there any opportunity, a way of doing an interim review? Or are the figures set for a full year and we can't revisit them in the light of experience?
We have set fees and charges mid-year before. What I would say is it's not good practice, and I very much doubt that my colleagues in the accountancy and finance team will be very happy to do this, because this feeds into the budget forecast process for the council for the entire year. However, we're not talking about council tax fees or anything like that. They're relatively small elements of the overall budget. So I would say to you that it's always possible to change fees mid-year, but generally not good practice either way, unless we found that it was considerably out. And as I say, we always review them as it is. But for example, perhaps you could have argued that we could have changed the animal welfare fees this year when we were discovering it was taking 4 or 5 times longer than we thought.
Councillor Hussey.
Just a quick question. At some future meeting, 4 months down the road, can we just have a very brief interim report about how we're performing against these budget estimates, individual fees?
We can look at we obviously have a monthly update on through the council budget amounts, which are available to you on through the HR through the council website, to look at how individual profit and cost centres are performing. What I would say, the difficulty with all these fees is that they don't always come in and evenly spaced throughout the year. So, for example, most of our taxi licensing is a bit like our LAO3 is done around the November-October period. Yeah, so we could review them at the half-year period and have very little information to go on.
We don't want to increase more fees for us. Right, the recommendation is to approve the licensing fees and charges set out in Appendix 1, which will apply from the 1st of April 2020. All those in favour, please say. Agree? Agreed. Thank you very much.
Just one last thing before we all rush off into the lovely evening that we have. I will be running an additional course on licensing. If anybody missed the training either here or at Hearts, or if you know of any of your peers who missed the training, on the 5th of March at from 6 o'clock till 7:30 here. Yeah, so I know the invite's gone out, but just a little plea that if anybody's missed that, then I shall be doing a rerun of it. Excellent news. I didn't. So okay, just
What's the training is about?
licensing training. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, you've done it.